techniques firsthand. Kelman also pointed out or discussed at some length Jim's enormous enthusiasm for experimental research where you could do it. You know, this is obviously the high point of scientific methodology. So what was the difference between Jim and mainstream political scientists? I think that it was that Jim didn't care too much what methods he was using. He wanted to use whatever methods will teach us the most first. That is, there are advantages of starting with open-ended observation. Go and look and see what's happening. Don't try quantitative studies before you have a reasonably good basis for deciding what data we need. Now, there are a couple of, I think I'll pass over a couple of things somewhat quickly. I want to, actually, Dan's paper is a lot about one of the kinds of reasons why it's inefficient or not so useful to use quantitative methods in certain contexts, namely that some kinds of units don't compare very well. It's more useful to look at them one at a time. I just want to comment quickly that Steve intentionally, whether he intended it or not, I think may have given the impression that Dan is launching a broader attack against quantitative research than I believe that Dan is launching. I think his point is that there are some kinds of things studied that are one way and others studied the other way. I want to mention also that Dan is the best person listen carefully, in history to address this matter, this question of the kind of trade-off or conflict between quantitative and qualitative research. And for this reason, Dan's quantitative and technical work in political science in journals like the AJPS is at the forefront of technical sophistication in quantitative research in political science. A small fraction of political scientists can read Dan's technical work. Right? I don't believe that there has ever been another person who has reached that level of sophistication in quantitative methods who has then gone, has then spent so much time in archives analyzing documents, doing qualitative research and reporting research in a qualitative manner. Dan's most recent book on the Food and Drug Administration is essentially all qualitative. There's a few pages of statistics here and there. This is the best book ever written on a regulatory agency, I believe, or at least it's certainly the most thorough. It's about 900 pages. Starts from the beginning of the FDA and very thorough on every period, and lots of issues since then. I should say, to keep you from being intimidated by the 900 pages, it's very lively and engaging. It's just like reading 600 pages. There are other reasons for being, there are other reasons besides the countability and comparability problem for doing qualitative research first. But so what do I think is Wilson's program and how would he proceed? I think that the book on bureaucracy is a theoretical work. Dan analyzes his methods of categorization and development of typologies on the assumption that Jim was doing science. That is, there's no recognition whatsoever to Jim's occasional remarks that he wasn't doing theory in Dan's interpretation. I don't think it deserves any recognition. I think Jim was wrong about that. I actually complained about Jim's preface, which he circulated to quite a number of his graduate students for making those remarks, which I thought were gratuitous and inaccurate. If I had known about it, I'd have used a quote from David Foster Wallace, who was writing about one of the commentators on one of his drafts. It was, just how much reader irritation are you shooting for? But Jim did not change that text. But the big point I would make is that the structure of the structure of theorizing in that book is essentially like psychology. It's not like economics, but it's like lots of sciences, and in particular, it's like psychology. There's an image about why psychology is the way it's like from a book by Steven Pinker, and that is to say that the mind is a society of programs, as programs like computer programs, sets of instructions, and it's a society. It's not a hierarchy. They compete with each other and they operate at the same time. And so you're not going to get theory that has the structure of economics out of that. Jim was theorizing in a way that's appropriate to the nature of the subjects that he addresses. So what's Wilsonian political science be doing? Be doing more case studies, along the same lines on bureaucracy, but it should also be thinking about when to get started testing some of the notions on large data sets of government agencies and clarifying the theory. I think that book is being squarely in the realm of exploratory social science that should be pursued, more theorizing and eventually quantification.
Thank you, Paul. Harvey.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be part of this conference, but the bio did my greatest achievement. I was J.Q. Wilson's first PhD student, and he got better at it later on. I was the first. And I've been asked today to talk about Jim's contributions to international relations, national security, and defense politics, my own little subfield. And there are two ways that you could describe his contribution. One is the direct public service, of which I know very little. He was in the Navy, served on advisory committees, and most particularly the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which is makes me happy that the government was wise enough to turn to him. And then the second way is through his writings on American politics, organizational theory, and bureaucracy, which most of us are familiar with. I like them all, but one of the ones that's had the biggest impact on me since I studied the military a lot is a little op-ed that he did for the Wall Street Journals that maybe it's my ethnic background too that makes me remember this very much. He talked about pork being kosher in American politics. And this is lost a lot on the American military. Not that they're unsophisticated at the highest levels about the importance of politics to their success, but they talk in terms of this being a political enterprise that they're involved in, that there's some technical or professional organization, and politics has intrudes only on their activities. And I was reminded about this most graphically in one of the series that Tufts University dinners that they run, I imagine at great profit, for the military, which they had a series rotating among the services, and this year was always held up. This in Cambridge was the Navy's turn, and a fleet of admirals showed up, including the Chief of Naval Operations, and the main speaker was John P. Murtha, who was the head of the Defense Subcommittee Appropriations in the House, and a big porker, if there ever was one, in the Congress.
I think in more senses than one.
Excuse me?
In more senses than one.
And certainly in the one that's most relevant here. And he gave Bertha gave a good talk from the Navy's perspective about how we need more of a big Navy and how wonderful a Navy was. And the admirals were very pleased. And then he took questions. And from my table, I had nothing to do with it, a junior officer in Navy ROTC at MIT raised his hand and said, Mr. Murtha, why are you spending the most important money we have on pork in your district? And I thought for sure, and they were all dressed in uniforms, the admirals, but they didn't have to dress swords. If they did, I'm sure the casino would have ordered one of the admirals to run this guy through with his sword. But Murtha just ignored it and went and gave some bland answer, which made the rest of the day possible. I know the Navy and certainly the Marine Corps didn't like Murtha, even though the Marine Corps made him a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. They didn't like him partly because he accused the Marine Corps of atrocities in Iraq and other things. It's not a pleasant thing, but you'll be happy to know that the Navy never forgot who he was. That in 2015, the USS John P. Murtha will be at sea. It's an LPD number 26, and it just is a testimony to how the Navy at the lower levels may not understand what the Navy's all about, but at the high levels, they do. And we will have a ship named after Congressman Murtha, the big porker. The Navy knows that gets you ships, those kinds of gestures. My own work is focused more on military innovation, and here the most important work to me was I think a work that's pretty obscure to most of you, something that Jim wrote called Innovation in Organizations, Notes Towards a Theory. It appeared in a book edited by James D. Thompson called Organizational Design. And it was based on Clark and Wilson approach to organizational innovation by using incentive theory. And it argues that it's very hard to understand innovations in organizations, and that the more diverse, and he meant diverse in the sense of different kinds of tasks and incentives the organization has, the more likely innovative ideas will be presented. And then he said the more diverse the organization is in that sense, the more likely that there'll be counter proposals offered for innovation in the organization. But the more diverse the organization in that sense is, the less likely the organization will be able to adopt the innovation. And it was very accurate. I think the prime example in the field, the star kind of organization in the field for innovation was, at that time was, though Jim used urban examples, urban politics examples, so I'll point out, but was the university. And the university bubbles with ideas. It's a very diverse kind of organization in the sense of different departments and counter proposals, but nothing ever gets done because it was praised because that's where you get ideas, but as an organization, it doesn't innovate at all. It really changes curriculum. I was once on a calendar committee at MIT. I quit after 8 years or 4 years of trying to change the calendar. They, just moved the graduation day. It's impossible. It interfered with somebody's religious holiday, but every other day it did too, so it got nowhere. But he used urban politics examples. He talked about Mayor Daley, I guess the original Mayor Daley in Chicago, having tight control over the many parts of the political regime in Chicago. So if he wanted something to get done, but the problem was he wasn't presented with many ideas, but people were afraid to present ideas because in case he didn't like it. And then he contrasted that with New York City, where it's very diverse, lots of organizations, nobody, maybe now, Bloomberg is a little different, but it was very diverse and lots of ideas, but nothing could get done because there was no centralizing organization. Well, I look at military organizations as pretty centralized organizations, so if you get to know them in some detail, they have the diverse elements to it. But basically, they're little hierarchies, and so it's hard to get them to change. And so I've been interested in how to change, and there are three basic theories of military innovation. One is that my colleague Barry Posen is the proponent of this. It's basically these organizations are done. Battleship admirals, they don't change, and so it has to be imposed upon them from the outside. They're too stupid to he wouldn't use that word, but too stupid to think of these things, so someone has to beat it into him and make it happen. An example he uses is the British Air Force prior to World War II. They were bomber Air Force. Unfortunately, the Germans had bombers, so that political machine, just as the politicians in Britain had to coerce the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, to start to think about air defenses just as the war started. If they hadn't, it would have been a disaster. This contrasts with another theory that, and Steve Rosen at Harvard is the proponent of this one, is that these are organizations, they can't really be interfered with. It's a slow, gradual process, generational. Somebody gets a leader, he gets a mentor a little higher up in the organization, and he sort of drags the idea up slowly over 20 and 30 years. And the examples that Steve Rosen uses is basically from the interwar period. Well, we're always in the interwar period, aren't we? But the one that we talk about is between World War I and World War II, and amphibious warfare, and all of that grew up during, carry aviation grew up during that period, but it was slowly perking up. And took 20 years, 30 years to take over the organization. And then there's the third theory, the one I like. It's that these things happen faster and against the organizations, even self-interest sometimes, through inter-service rivalry. I talked about markets and things, but the government has rivalry within itself. There's organizations that fight one another, and that's the one I like. I think that works. But as Jim also pointed out in that little article I like so much, that it's doubtful that there's one theory of innovation, even one theory of innovation for a particular set of organizations like militaries, that it'd be like having one theory of disease, that you really need to think about it in a broader way, and that these probably work out for different time periods, and as I think that's the case very much so. The rivalry is, to me, been central to understanding how government policy is made, and it drove the Navy, in case Jim was very helpful in my writing of this book on Polaris, because it pushed the Navy to do something that really wasn't what it wanted to do, but was very important to the country. So the services gets nervous, they're in rivalry, they don't know, they want to succeed in serving the nation, but they have particular kinds of technologies they promote, and this, as was the case at the end of the Second World War, nuclear weapons were coming and the Navy had no role. It's a very complex story why they were excluded from this activity, and they saw their future disappearing. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of doubt about why they should go into this business at all, and they weren't even allowed to go into the business. But they fought hard, and screwed the Army in a variety of ways, and pushed them out, and got to what we now rely on, and what we could rely on forever is the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And it turned out not to be in the organization's interest, particularly because they had to pay for it. It wasn't an extra amount of money given to them. It came out of the repair budget and all the other activities of the Navy. So it was painful, and wouldn't have done it unless they were in this competition. Well, what has happened in more recent years is we've moved towards jointness, where the services are collaborating and cooperating, and the Department of Defense itself has become more centralized. It's one peak card on the civilian side, and now it's been made that way on the military side of the Department of Defense. And Jim rightly saw rivalry as a leverage for the Congress, as a way in which the Congress learned about what the alternatives were, not only as a spur to innovation, but as a way of gaining control of the organizations and directing policy. And in the text with John, the American Government textbook, I noticed there's a puzzlement about the chapter on national security is terrific. I thought I had those ideas. It's actually someone else's ideas. But there's a puzzlement. Why is the Congress allowing this set of bureaucracies to centralize? And why don't they challenge it? Well, what it is jointness is not only religion among the military services, it's a cartel. And the cartel is happy with the present outcomes. There's a share of the budget, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and no one deviates from this. The civilians who manage them want a quiet life. They don't like the fighting. And so the Congress gets no information. It's not opposed to this because none of the services comes to them to complain. But I still think there's hope. See, I'm in favor of the noisy, rivalrous relationships, and that would be a spur to policy. See? And I think Jim would appreciate this, that this American system bubbles with competition. It's hard to suppress it, even though people would try. So cartels, and we have antitrust laws and prevent it from the side, and there's ways in which the political system is a cartel too. Among the services, while we were working towards this centralization, we quietly, for a variety of reasons, created another organization called a Special Operations Command, which is made up of little pieces from all the services, but it essentially, in a variety of ways, is an independent department. It has its own budget, it has its own leadership. It's run not by civilians like the other part of the department, it's actually run, the budget is run by a military person. And so we're creating, this is joy to me, a rivalry between those three services and a new one that's being created. So I think Jim will be happy, and I'm certainly happy about the way things are starting to evolve.
Thank you. Well, this has been a great discussion from a theoretical perspective, impact of James Q. Wilson's work domestically, internationally, from the perspective of those who actually, like Steve, who actually try to make things work. We have 5 minutes for questions, and we can discuss further at lunch. Any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Linda McClain at Boston University, and I actually had a question about the military, if I can ask that. Because just yesterday in one of my classes, I was teaching about kind of the two developments of trying to open more positions up to women, but on the other hand, trying to deal with the problem of military sexual assault. And what's interesting is, in the literature, there's on the one hand, a lot of references to how it's consistent with professional values and professional culture, core values, to remedy the problem of sexual assault. But on the other hand, there's all this discussion, about how a culture, a particular culture within the military, of hypermasculinity and a culture of retaliation is conducive to and a factor in sexual assault. So I'm just curious about how an expert on institutions might think about these conflicting messages about culture and professionalism and how to think about an institution and bring about change.
I'm not an expert on that part of the military, but again, the services compete. The services are not the same in terms of percentage of female, but you should be aware of that. And Air Force is much more dependent on females or
It has the highest
Yes.
position open to women, right?
Yes, so
99%.
and as things become more technological, the need for the kind of distinctions that have been made in the past will probably disappear. But the services have been very good at social adjustment. They've integrated racially. Their gender is just another one of the steps I think they'll take. So yes, mixing young men and young women together can lead to problems, but I don't think the organization will fail to adjust to that. I'm sorry, I don't have a better way of approaching the issue.
Steve?
Yeah, real quick question for Dan. I mean, again, as I read Dan's paper, I think very differently than Steve did. It's not about quantitative versus qualitative, right? It's about when in the process of analysis, right, one kind of form of analysis is more appropriate or not, right? And I think part of it is you can do quantitative analysis once you've pretty substantially stabilize some category, right? So that you're pretty sure it's the same thing, right? And then you can do, quite sophisticated quantitative analysis. The professional problem, right, is that if that's the way you view social science, right, you need both forms of knowing, right, within the discipline. And yet, as we know, right, there's been this general process of shifting away from the people who arguably are the ones developing the categories and doing that original work, the kind that Paul's talking about, and the people then who are doing the high-powered quantitative analysis. So I guess one question is, as an organization, what can we say about the profession of political science that is an explanation for why it's impossible to have a stable balance or relationship between these two forms of knowing, rather than have it shift pretty strongly all the way over to one, even though arguably they should be mutually reinforcing.
Can I just, could you repeat the question so that we can get it on the...
Oh, okay. Well, I think one of the principal questions here is what's the relationship between not just an either or choice between quantitative and qualitative work, and then what does it say about us as a profession that we seem to lurch between one or the other, this kind of artificial binarism, as opposed to potential combinations of the two. If I've badly done justice to your question, Steve, you can slap me later. I want to just, sort of point out a couple things here. I think people can and do make quantitative comparisons all the time, and they should, and with France as a case. But the question of whether those comparisons are meaningful and whether that we learn from them in truly informative ways, I think is a separate question. It depends as much upon qualitative criteria as it does upon the elegance of the quantitative analysis. For me, the opposite of countable is not idiosyncratic as much as it is non-separable and or not countable or countable only in a certain sense. Let me give you a couple of examples. I did write on the FDA, as Paul said, 800, 600 pages, wherever. And I thought at the end, could one get into a quantitative analysis of pharmaceutical regulators, a Wilsonian analysis within categories of pharmaceutical regulators around the world? I actually think that would be a worthwhile thing to do once one recognizes that a wide variety of pharmaceutical regulators around the world, the EU, Australia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, China, have modeled themselves explicitly upon the FDA. And so the eventual assumption that you always have to fall back on in quantitative analysis, independent and identically distributed, IID, has to be thrown out the window unless you can model and explicitly account for that dependence in a very specific way. The final, and this is going to give me a chance to defend, I hope, Wilson against Lowry, is the idea of non-separability. The Lowry went after Wilson saying, well, broken windows was wrong, and how do we know this? And I'm not being fair to Lowry here, but he wasn't really being fair to Wilson. So by saying, well, let's look at Steve Levitt's work in Freakonomics and things like that. And Levitt has this famous study where he says, let's try to disentangle policing and crime, right? Because the two are deeply endogenous. So what does Levitt do? He looks at election years. And election years, the number of police goes up. By his accounting, that's patronage, right? Let's just, and sure enough, using that as an instrumental variable of what he thinks is an exogenous shock to policing, he finds that afterwards crime goes down. Well, count me as a skeptic, because lots of other things happen during election years, as political scientists well know. Social services change, community beautification changes, in other words, broken windows might be repaired. Lots of other spending occurs. And so in my mind, what Levitt has shown us and what Lowry wants to rely upon is that during elections, in ways that are very hard to map in generalizable ways, crime often declines. But to sort of attribute that to policing, as opposed to broken windows, as opposed to community organization, as opposed to 5 or 6 other causal pathways, seems to me deeply problematic. Steve Levitt's a really bright guy, it doesn't make him right. And the question here is again about the separability of these different causal pathways. And that to me is where the quantitative analysis often gets into trouble, is like, well, let's just take the partial derivative as if there was one, as if there was a separability between these variable causal pathways. Sorry to enter into the crime world, which is way outside of my area, but I just felt I had to.
We're going to have to go into recess. Shep?
Yeah, I understand that these doors will magically open and there will be food on the other side. And I think the plan is that in the next 15 or 20 minutes, if you could get your lunch, and then we will start in about 1:15 with a couple of talks over lunch.
Shep, we should bring our stuff in here.